Okay.
And welcome to Angry Robot Live. We are here on Google Plus with authors Anna Kashina and Kameron Hurley, and we are going to be talking scope and scale in fantasy. I'm your host, Angry Robot Sub-Overlord Michael R. Underwood, Sales and Marketing Manager par something, possibly excellence, on a good day.
You
And
could say you are.
oh, thank you. So Jim Moore and Paul Kemp were unfortunately unable to join us tonight, but Paul Kemp sent out some great comments on Twitter earlier today. I'll make sure to get those into the wrap-up post. And we have with us two authors of fantasy at a nice kind of compared level of scale and scope. And I wanted to use this framing as a way to talk about fantasy and then to dig into maybe some of the subgenres, how we balance kind of big, widescreen epic fantasy scale while keeping things kind of emotional and character driven, and how you tell a good story at any given scale in the world of fantasy.
Oops.
Oh no, we're in recursion land.
I know we're
Sorry.
No, it's all
we're
good.
in that perpetual loop,
Okay, it's done. It's done.
similar to Star Trek,
That was
actually.
me. Okay.
All right, and I need to make sure that this is all sent out into the world. Nope, that's not right. Okay, and make sure that people on Twitter can follow us. And if you are not able to watch the video, but you want to ask a question, please go ahead and tweet out to hashtag ARLive with your question. And this can be about our topic or other questions about writing and fantasy and so on and so forth for our authors. So I wanted to start with just a question for each of you on how you decided the degree of kind of widescreen versus close in that you chose for your fantasy series with Angry Robot. You know, how did you decide what scale you wanted to work with, and how has that experience been, especially compared to any other fantasy maybe that you've written previously? If we can start with Anna.
Yeah. So, yeah, I was actually thinking of how to choose a story, and I feel like in a way, stories choose you. So I feel like definitely in my case, I don't really decide on a story as much as a kind of I know this. So I mean, stories are obviously in the air and the ideas are in the air, but sometimes it just clicks and I know this is what I'm going to write. So to me, the word epic, kind of, which is my genre, epic fantasy, implies a certain scope which has to be bigger than probably one family or one village. So my perfect scope of a fantasy series is probably a kingdom which is in context of other kingdoms around it, and of course it has to be character driven, so it has to be balanced with like the characters' personal problems and how they deal with them. So I think so the scope kind of has to stay between very small one-person problems and the kingdom. I think so it kind of comes to me naturally. So I think more than a kingdom probably would be too much. And when I was thinking about how I choose that, it's probably kind of reflects how we're brought up. So we live in a certain country, and we tend to think of a world in the sense of like a place we live in the context of this country, and probably being aware that there are other countries outside it, but they're not immediately relevant to us. So I think for me, the scope kind of has been very natural in my writing as well. So I'm not sure.
Okay. And Cameron, how did you kind of set the stakes, and especially for the version that we're going to get to see, because I know that the Worldbreaker saga has kind of gone through a couple of iterations.
Just a few, just a few. When I came up with this story back in my ambitious young days. I was like, oh, I'm gonna do like a Robert Jordan 15 book series, and it'll be amazing, and it'll be this epic thing in scope, and we'll travel around the entire world, and there'll be all these great reveals and hundreds of characters, and it'll be great. And of course, then the crashing reality of publishing, came at me, and everyone I was like, okay, well maybe I can do it in 7 books. And they're like, you're not going to do 7 books, and I was like, well, there's a 5 book series. I've seen people do 5 book series. They say, Cameron, you're a new novelist. You're not going to be able to sell a 5 book series. And I said, okay, 3. We'll do 3 with an optional 2. And they're like, okay, you can do that. And so for me, I initially had come at this after I finished up my God's War series, and that was much smaller in scope. It was very much like the little, the crazy bounty hunter ragtag team post-apocalyptic world, and it was very much about, yeah, there's this overarching plot of go and get the MacGuffin over here, but it was much more about their internal struggles and the interactions that they had together. So I really wanted to do something different with Mirror Empire. I wanted to explore a literally like it is the end of the world. I love that stuff about epic fantasy, right? I love, oh, it's the end of the world and there's the amazing stakes. Literally, the world will be destroyed if these people don't stop it. Um, so I thought that was really fascinating, and I wanted to do something similar, but that I could somehow compress into 3 books. And I realized some people are like, oh, you could totally do that in 3 books. That's a classic, 3 book series. But when you go from 15 books, you're like, oh, now for marketing reasons and sales reasons, you need to do 3. That's really hard. And so I had to I had to really scale down the types of stories I was telling. I needed to take out a lot of characters. I needed to focus on particular characters instead of making it again that cast of thousands.
Yeah.
Which to me was still, quite satisfying. And honestly, I think for the place that I am in my skill level, I think this is probably the right decision. Um, it was certainly challenging. I think you should always be writing the book that you're not quite ready to write. And I think I was certainly there a few times where I went, oh, I don't know if I can do this. But it turned out all right. And I think it was certainly a refreshing change from the God's War books, which were so much smaller in scope.
Okay. And then for both of you, go back to Anna, how has the scope changed, if at all, as you're moving from book 1 into book 2 and thinking about any plans or whatever for books beyond that in the series? Does the scope and scale change with the story? And if so, how does that interact with the way that you present the story or the characters or the plotting?
Yeah. So yeah, actually, I thought it was very interesting, and yeah, I thought it was interesting listening to Cameron and the way she went from 15 books to 3. So in a way, yeah, of
I
course,
did
I
too.
also have a 15-book series in mind. But if every one of my books is a standalone, because I mean, for various reasons, yeah, I just do like to wrap up all the plot lines in each book. But then what I found is, so you take this, I mean, the scope that you've chosen, which in my case is a kingdom, and you wrap up the story, you kind of, if you created a good world, you always end up having something to continue. So something that has to be resolved, even though you resolved everything possible. And in my case, in my book too, I took out one of these plot lines, which I just had to follow through, and spun it out into another story, which ended up being the whole book. And even though it's again about saving the kingdom, it just kind of happened to be happening on a smaller scale in a more confined place. So it was more about one city than about one kingdom. And it was much more focused on characters and their interactions. So I did kind of go from this kingdom scale to the like city scale in a way. And in the book 3, on which I'm working right now, I'm planning to try to go back to the kingdom scale. And it creates a really interesting contrast, because you just start, so it's the same people, but when you scale down in terms of like space and time, maybe you have a lot more space to develop your characters. And I think it just so potentially the switch can give you this amazing level of depth, which probably is, if you're writing about 100 characters in a galaxy, it's much harder to get this depth compared to like 3 characters in a small town. So yeah, I think this changing of scopes, it's in fact an interesting tool, which after I've done this, it has been eye-opening to me, and I think I would like to explore it more in my later books, certainly. So.
Cool. So for you, Cameron, what does kind of the shape of book 2 lean, like kind of leading, especially towards book 3, because you're trying to fit the whole story in? How much has the change in scope and scale been a part of the move from book 1 to book 2, or is there any kind of movement on that level?
I think that for me, what I really needed to concentrate on was saying how many new characters are you really going to introduce in book two that you then have to follow all the way through book two? How many people need to die in book two so we can make room for all the other stories that we want to tell? I think for me, it was a matter of saying, okay, privileging um, certain narratives, right? And saying, okay, yes, these are the I think I was mapping out recently, and I actually have 12 point of view characters in book two, and I was like, well, I already know some of these people are going to die. Some other ones need to die a lot sooner, and also just choosing. And this was something that I think was sort of a revelation to me, and that we are only going to show the scenes that are necessary to reach that person's arc. So I'm going to have, there might be a point of view character who goes through their entire arc for the book in 3 chapters. And they'll be interspersed throughout the entire book. You'll get one early, one middle, one later, but they will experience a full arc. Um, and then mapping out, okay, some of those are going to get 5 chapters, some are going to get 10, some are going to get they're going to be very different, and some only get one. Sometimes it's just, this is a view that you need of this other thing that sort of illuminates another person's story. And I think for me what happened in book two was I needed to be a lot more careful and particular about who I was choosing to showcase and what I was choosing to say with them, much more than the first book, because you have to, again, you want to be closing in on, you're closing in. This is the Empire Strikes Back, right? You need that middle book. My agent was great. She's like, "Oh, Empire Strikes Back, Mirror Empire. Oh, too bad that title's taken." Anyway, um, so you have to be very clear, like there is an endpoint and you need to reach that. And that I think is my struggle right now, is saying, okay, how am I going to wrap all of this up again in the 3 books and have a satisfying conclusion for book two, which is always very difficult as well when it's that middle book, again, Empire Strikes Back of the series, where you want kind of everything to be um, very, kind of a cliffhanger, but at the same time, everyone has an arc and very interesting. So it's certainly challenging, is all I have really about that with book two. It is a challenge.
So with that many point of view characters, do you have like a big murder board where you kind of have all of the outlines set, or do you have like another version of the map where you have little pins to keep track of people? Like,
Here's where
how do you?
they die,
I've
splatter marks. I just throw
You
paint.
like
I've never done a book that had that many POV characters that weren't one-offs.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
cannot imagine, like, I would love to hear some of your approaches, especially ones that have worked, or maybe lessons from ones that have been not as useful in trying to manage a cast that's that big, especially when some people are far less or more important in terms of their screen time.
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, I did. I finally had to give in and do a murder board. I had a whiteboard, and I sat down and I took the 12 names, and I had the book in 3 acts. So there were 3 major things that happened across like all the storylines, and a lot of the magical system in my world is based on the satellites and what comes up and what goes down within the sky, what's not. So one of those is a heavenly body comes into the sky, and another one is, this great. There's a big battle, and another one is some other stuff. And I said, okay, at those 3 points, where are all these characters at? So here is their turning point at each of those larger plot points. Here are their individual points. So once I had all of that mapped out, that made it a lot easier to go, okay, how many chapters do I really need from their point of view to get me to these 3 plot points. Um, so yeah, I relied on the murder board, and then I also, something I learned writing God's War was I have a sheet that says for every single character who is a point of view character in the book, what do they want? What does this person want, and do they get it? And this seems like a simple question, right? But when I was writing the God's War books, that saved everything. Like that made it so much easier to plot out the entire book, was because it was very much about those stories and what those people wanted. So once I understood what that was, everything else flowed from that. And
So
that's something
would
that
you
I did early on
would you
in
say
our
that
empire. Oh,
would you say that's a way of kind of keeping the personal kind of front and center in a story that's much bigger? Is that has that been kind of useful along that angle, or did you have other agendas for it?
sure. Well, and you have to understand, people are like, well, how do you get an audience interested in, oh, the world's going to end? Listen, if something matters to the characters, it's going to, and the people, and the reader cares about the characters, then the reader's going to care.
Yeah.
Your job is not necessarily, oh, I have to have the coolest, biggest, baddest explosions. It's, I need to have characters who want things who people identify with, because as soon as those people identify with them, they're like, oh, this is amazing. um, and then they respond to that. So I think that is the key in particular, is if they care, the reader will care, if the readers like them enough.
Yeah.
Right. So, Anna, are there any techniques or tools that you've used to kind of keep track of continuity on characters as you're kind of you've done book two and now you're thinking about book three, or any tools that you wish that you'd had earlier on in the process?
Well, so I can probably, as I was thinking, how many characters are too many for me. So I feel like I can manage maybe 3 or 4. I cannot manage 15. And with 3 or 4 characters, it's kind of, I suppose it's easier to keep track of them. But at the same time, a lot of times in my books, so in Blades of the Old Empire, I had these 2 parallel timelines which had to match exactly because the characters go through very different points, but it's critical that they arrive at the same place at the same time. So I kind of had to time it down to which mounts they use and which means of transportation and like the distances and everything. And in that case, I had these 2 parallel timelines, and I had like day one, this character is doing this character is doing that. And so I haven't. So I can keep probably this way. I could keep 3 parallel timelines at most, and then each there had to be a major character who was a point of view character. So yeah, I think it worked very well for me as a tool. Um, Overall, what is increasingly working for me and what I wish I have realized when I just started writing is so at the beginning I do extensive work to create a character. So I sit down and I imagine this person down to looks, clothing, habits, vocabulary, everything. So I spent a lot of time. The name has to match perfectly. So it has to become a real person in my mind. And once that happened, when I throw these people into a conversation, I literally all I have to do is just sit back and write down what they say. So I don't invent phrases for them. And in fact, when they're asked the question, I have no idea what they're going to say. And this real person is going to say what they would say, and they have surprised me many times. So I think in book one, this work has been done. So by book two, the characters have been so real to me that I just had to like I thought of it as watching a movie. I was sitting down and just writing down what they're doing, and I could adjust things a little the way I wanted the story to go, but I really never had to, I mean, keep track or think about them, so they kind of thought and solved the problems for me. So I think if I manage to achieve this state with any of my books, it's just, I mean, it becomes pure joy to write it, and everything falls into place. And it requires a lot of background work, which, as I now know, is much more extensive than I originally believed. So it kind of at the beginning it was a lot of stumbling around. So yeah,
Is that
I
I know a few writers who have that kind of actors play out in front of me, and I'm the writer, and then I just take notes. Um, has it always been like that for you in terms of you develop a character and then you've got a really clear sense, and they either seem like they're acting on their own or it's very easy to know what they would do? Like, has it always
yeah.
been like that, or do you have a sense of kind of how it developed into that for you?
So yeah, no, it's a good question. No, it hasn't always been like this, and I really wish it has. So with my first novels, it was much more kind of constructed. So I had to really, I mean, it was different kind of novel. So the first novel where it happened for me was Blades of the Old Empire, which is book one in my series. And it happened almost accidentally. So I just created a character that I absolutely loved. And this character, just every time he acted, I thought, wow, I would never have thought somebody would say that, but it just makes perfect sense. And then, so once I realized that, and I realized how well it's working, I kind of went back and tweaked some other characters in the series. So in the end, all the major characters kind of became like that. But yeah, this is a skill which I learned like after I wrote my first 4 novels without this skill in mind. And I think it's just really something that, yeah, it's still, darn, I wish I've known that from the beginning. That's how it should be done. So,
Yeah, because that kind of reminds me of my own experience, and I don't have characters that are quite that they take charge, but I know a lot of writers who were gamers and who were performers. Do you have a performance background at all in your life?
no,
No,
I'm
really?
actually,
Okay, that's
I'm,
that's an interesting contrast.
and I'm
Uh,
not a gamer, even though, yeah, I did like computer games at some point in my life, but I never did role-playing games or anything. But
okay.
yeah, it's kind of different. It's not just action. It's just you have to imagine a character. And yeah, I know that it doesn't work every time. And if it worked, it's a really special feeling. So it kind of, I can't hope that every one of my characters will be like this. But in this series, I was lucky, I guess.
Yep. So Cameron, for you, in terms of developing characters, do the characters tend to come first, or does the world tend to come first? And like, do sometimes you have to cast a character into a role, or like, is it some mixture of any of these? And especially, kind of what does it take to get characters to be as emergent for you, or are they that emergent? You're very, very soft. Let me see if I can adjust that. Huh.
Okay.
Hmm. I shaking my fist.
No. Uh-oh.
Does this, oh, now it's turning off my video. Does this
That
work better?
that's
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
coming through fine on me for
That's,
audio.
uh-huh.
Okay,
Go ahead.
we'll switch then. Okay, moving on. Hand wave, technical difficulties, totally sci-fi future. Okay, so what happens for me is I have a character. Almost all of my stuff starts with characters. With Mirror Empire, it was Lilia and Akio in particular. And with God's War, it was this line, right? It was Nyx sold her womb somewhere between Panjai and Feline on the edge of the desert. And what that immediately did was when I had that line, I said, who is that person, right? Who the heck does that? And as soon as I started thinking of who is this person, I had to think, what sort of a world makes this person? And that sort of became pretty much like everything with all of my world building has been that way. Okay, if I have, this particular person, how has the culture and the environment and everything that they've experienced up until that point, how has it shaped them and made them who they are? So all of my world building actually starts from character, which I think people are often surprised to hear. It's not kind of reverse engineered and, oh, who are some cardboard people to run around in the world? It's, okay, who are the people? And then the world comes next. So it's interesting what you asked, Anna, about performance backgrounds and stuff. I don't game, but I did a lot of high school theater. And so for me, it was all about, you need to learn empathy and you need to be able to put yourself into someone else's shoes. And what I realized was that, I'd been writing since I was 12 years old, and it was very easy for me. It was very easy for me to get up onto stage and go, yes, I'm someone else, and we are doing this thing, and I could completely step into, you could do Our Town, which has no set dressing whatsoever. Everyone's just in black, and there's some benches, and I could see it, right? I could see the kitchen and the street and all these things because I had trained myself for so long in my writing to sort of visualize, these fantastic places. And I think that then, from that point on, I could also take some of the blocking things I learned as far as with theater and apply those to my writing work. So yeah.
Now I want to do like drama theater at conventions with writers.
Yes.
Because
I think that'd be awesome.
We have plenty of time to do this.
In our spare time, between the podcast and the web series we'll start, and all those other things that we have. Yeah.
It's way not more work than author D&D, which already is really involved.
Right? That's true. That's true. After author D&D, it can't be any tougher. So
I bet we could put together drunken writer Shakespeare.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
That seems viable.
Yeah.
Anna, you want to get in on that?
What, on drunken writer Shakespeare? I don't know.
Yes.
Sure, yes. Let's do that. No, I've never been acting because I've always been shy, so I have this low voice. Actually, I always wanted to act, but in school they never took me into any plays because you couldn't hear me on stage.
Oh no! See, I've always been a loud mouth. That was never a problem. Yeah.
So I can do the drunken part of somebody else's Shakespeare. Yeah.
All right. Well, now that we've figured out some programming for Confusion next year.
I know. Now we're ready. Again, got to get ready for the 2015 con season. It's coming.
Yeah.
Cries.
We're ready.
To kind of shift topics a little bit, I'd love to ask each of you to switch onto your reader hat, and can you talk a little bit about, do you tend to want to read at the level of scale and scope that you write at, or are you writing in a way that's different than what you either see in the world or than what you tend to prefer? Is there a contrast there, or if it's the same, how does what you read influence how you do scope? And we'll start with Kameron.
I had to make this confession on Rocket Talk last night to Justin and Liz, and I read about 6 or 7 books a year. Now I start a bazillion of books, right? I have piles and piles of books that I've started, but I don't actually finish a lot, and that's because I'm incredibly picky. I have to have very, very specific things. It has to have a lushness of language. It needs to have, often it needs to be a secondary world fantasy. It needs to be something that I feel like I've never read before. It needs to be very smart. And a lot of the criteria that I have, my husband just shakes his head all the time. He reads very widely. But one of the reasons I'm so specific is just because I read a lot to challenge myself, and I read a lot for things which I find pleasurable that tend to be very much on the fringes, right? I'm sort of a new weirdy kind of reader. And so what I read are often things that challenge me. I love K.J. Bishop. I love Vandermeer, those sorts of books. I'm just starting a Nicola Griffith's Hild right now, and of course City of Stairs, Barbara Bennett. And they're very lush, beautiful, interesting sorts of books. And the reason that I end up, not finishing a lot is because I don't know that there's a huge number, or if there's not a huge number of those sorts of books, they're not being marketed very much, right? They're harder to find. You have to kind of go to a little bit more niche place if you want to read something like Angela Carter. So I certainly read to be challenged, but challenging for me is pleasurable. I find it to be a pleasure to read that, as opposed to maybe some other things that folks read. So,
yeah.
Do you find the books that you're kind of going to, are they usually wider scale, or they tend to be a little bit more narrowed in terms of scope?
It depends. I was a big Wheel of Time fan back in the day. I think what I like is stuff that's character driven. It can be a very large scope, story, as long as it's someone who does not neglect their characters or their language or their setting.
Yeah.
Which I think you do find more in smaller scale things, which I understand, having tried to write, you know, a massive epic that was very complicated. It's very difficult to do on a broad scale. When you only have 2 or 3 characters, you can spend a lot more time on your language. You can spend a lot more time on the interactions between those people, a lot more time developing those particular characters. It is much harder on a larger scale. So I probably, yeah, I'm trying to think. You know, the last epic fantasy I read, you know, it's been a while since I got through a multi-volume fantasy. You know, Daniel Abraham's Long Price Quartet, which I really enjoyed, and the Kashina books, of course. Saladin Ahmed's book, Through the Crescent Moon, was very good, and so we're just waiting for you to finish the other one, Saladin. No pressure.
Yeah.
But yeah, and those are a little bit larger in scope. But again, because I'm so particular, I don't read, I think, a lot of the epic fantasy. Because I've read some Joe Abercrombie. I love him with very specific types of books. I've read some George R. R. Martin, but I got kind of bored with it after a few books because it was kind of just more the same. And Robin Hobb was sort of the same, where it's like, okay, yes, I've read these books. So now I'm sort of, I think I end up trending toward books that I wish were certainly, you know, larger in scale. I know I need to read more Kate Elliott because, you know, I have such very specific tastes that they end up being things that are smaller in scope.
Okay. So Anna, like, what scale and scope do you tend to read, especially in epic fantasy? And are there any books where the structure or the scale specifically, you had those specifically in mind when you were coming up with the Majat Code?
Yeah, yeah. So I was actually, as I was listening to Kameron, I agree that I like. So first, yeah, I'm pretty picky, so I do start a lot of books and I don't finish a lot of them. So I read those Kindle samples and then go on. But then if I find something I like, I just really devour books by this author usually. And when it happens to me, it's very rewarding. So there's no limit. Like sometimes I read more, sometimes less. And yeah, I kind of tend. So I read for pleasure mostly. So I like to enjoy myself when I'm reading. I don't like to challenge myself. So in a way, I mean, yeah. So I tend to gravitate to books which are kind of, I guess, similar scope as mine, which have like a kingdom and secondary world fantasy. So those are the books I usually unconditionally enjoy. And yeah, one of my recent favorites is The 100,000 Kingdoms, which is probably not exactly
Yeah.
the same, but I just loved it. And actually, this book kind of restored my faith in secondary world fantasy because I felt like it was going to be all urban, and then now this book comes out, and now I realize it's all fine. So in general, I can imagine also good stories which are on a smaller scale. And it kind of, yeah, if you have good characters that you sympathize with and you just really want to know their story, I think the scale and scope doesn't matter much. But yeah, having said that, I do gravitate to books which are kind of my scope. So to say what influenced me the most, it's probably, yeah, Robert Jordan series early on and Terry Goodkind, and to some extent George R. R. Martin. But so because yeah, actually I started writing this series more than 10 years ago. So at that time, many of the recent books were not around. And yeah, in those books, I felt like this is the scope I kind of want to compare with. But it ended up being slightly different, probably not, I mean, not as grand as George Martin. And I mean, in some ways, probably a Terry Goodkind is the closest. But of course, yeah, it didn't end up being anything like those books. But yeah, I think definitely what I read at any moment influences me a lot. And sometimes when I love an author and I want this influence, I read more of this author when I'm writing. And one example like this is Terry Pratchett. I really admire his style, and I just try to read as much of him as I can. Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of ask one more scale and scope question, and then we'll kind of dive into the reader and the viewer questions. For each of you, how big is too big, and how small is too small? And feel free to answer this either as a reader in terms of what you prefer, or as a writer in terms of what you would want to write. And let's start with Anna.
Yeah, so as a reader, I would say my boundaries would be very wide because if it's well done, I'm willing to read something as small or as big as it takes.
Mhm.
Yeah, so, I mean, if this author kind of is talented enough to pull it off, yeah, I'm all for it. As an author, I would say that something on the level of like multiple kingdoms, kind of a whole world would be too big of a scope. So one kingdom with some kingdoms around it would be my limit of what I'm comfortable with as an author. And too small would be probably so if something happened like in one room during the entire novel, it would be too small. I mean, in terms of, so I tend to answer this in terms of place, but I guess scope also involves characters. So I can never write from single point of view, for example. I tried and it just doesn't work for me. It always comes up. So, for example, I want to have male and female point of view. I just feel that they both kind of complement each other in a way that I cannot possibly write a story from only one of them. If I chose one, it would be a female point of view, but I always end up with both. So yeah, I guess so one character and one small place would be too small, and more than three main characters would, and more than like a kingdom would be too big, I think, if that answers your question.
So now I want to know what a closed room epic fantasy would look like.
Yeah.
Well, it's the dude making all the decisions, right? You had the lady general in there, like, all right, I'm restricted to this one room, but I have to make all the decisions for the fate of humanity. And everybody kind of comes in, and or she has to like give orders through like little. Anyway, I'm
Yeah.
down with that challenge. Yeah.
Well, actually, yeah. So 100,000 Kingdoms happens in one house, technically.
Yep.
As scopes go, it probably is kind of on the smaller one, but yeah, yeah. Yeah, I forgot what we're talking about on epic fantasy.
There's a little bit with the whole cosmic scale, but that's a bit of a spoiler. But anyway, moving on.
How many worlds really can we throw in?
Yeah.
So Cameron, for you, like, what's too big or too small to kind of catch your interest?
I read Hatchet as a kid. I read all those, like the kid against the elements. It's one person against the environment. I think you have to be an incredibly talented writer to pull that off. I don't think it's something that I'm particularly interested in. And it was interesting what Anna said about, the point of view characters. I think it would be very difficult. It wouldn't be impossible for me to do a one point of view. But I know when I was writing the God's War books, one of the reasons I had multiple point of views was because Nyx, the main character, was such a sociopath. Like, to be in that person's point of view throughout the entire scope of the novel would have been very, very difficult. Not just for me as a writer, but I felt for readers, and I felt it was too much. And that was actually the reason I broke that up. But yeah, as a reader, one person against the elements, that's a classic story. Certainly nothing wrong with that, and something that I enjoy. How much is too much? Head hopping, War and Peace. I mean, after a while, it's just like you're like, okay, there's only so many times I can. You get kind of it's almost painful to get into someone's point of view and then leave it and get to someone else's point of view and leave it and get to someone else's point of view and leave it. So I think when you get to a certain point, and I think George Martin's kind of there with some of the later books, you're like, okay, I'm suffering some PTSD a little bit. I don't want to care for people who I know are going to die, and I have anxiety when I approach the text. That's a problem when that starts to happen. So yeah, I don't know. And of course, we're talking me and Mirror Empire, and as far as scope of geography, I don't know. Bring all the worlds in. The universes can collide. That's totally cool. And again, one person in a room, I'm like, challenge accepted. That could be awesome. So yeah, I'm totally down with anything anybody wants to do. A lot of these concepts, and a lot of these writing rules that we hear, you can't do X, Y, and Z, or you can do anything you want to do, you just need to be really good. And I think it just really comes down to the skill of the writer and how far they want to take things. So
yeah, I agree about George Martin. That is just
Yeah. I've been hearing that a lot. Like, I'm having some anxiety. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't like my favorite characters to be killed. But yeah, I gave up on the series, maybe exactly because of the scope, because I felt
Yeah.
like if I have a sense that it's going to end, I would probably read it, maybe, but if it, yeah. But yeah, it
Yep.
was getting, out of scope.
Nobody has narrativium shields, as a friend of mine said this
Yeah.
in George Martin. So I wanted to grab an audience question. This is going to be in the Q&A tab. I'm going to select it, and it should show up. And I'll go ahead and read it just so that it's all very understandable. This is from David Heyman. He asks, with the scope so large in an epic story, even more so in a multi-book plots, how do you know when to stop world building?
You never stop world building.
You never stop, David.
No, but world
Nice
building.
try.
World building is something that remains in the background. So yeah, it never stops, but it doesn't mean you have to write it all down. It has to be in your head, and I think the more the better, definitely. But it's like, so what it does is it creates the setting that otherwise we would know if we were writing about the real world. So like vocabulary, I don't know, clothes, customs. It all. I mean, yeah, the more you can do of that, the better, in my sense. But the less of it you can write down on the pages of your book, also the better. So probably, ideally, you have a perfect, complete world in your head, and you write down only the touches that you would do if you were writing about our world. So I don't know, Cameron, what do you think?
Well, I think people. This is what keeps a lot of people from starting writing, is they say, "Oh, I'm not done world building yet. I'm not done world building."
Mm-hmm.
The first draft of God's War was dialogue and fight scenes. It was dialogue and fight scenes, and a lot of actually Mirror Empire was mostly let's sit down. I sat down with the agent and we worked out plot. And a lot of those little world building details that people are like, "Oh, Cameron's an amazing world builder." I'm like, that comes at like literally with Mirror Empire, like the 13th hour. Like I was making pronoun changes right before we went to print. I was like, no, the ARC version can't go to print. We have to add all these things. And I'm making those little, and they seem very little. And I think it was actually Lee. I think Lee Harris had said something about I had gotten a starred review in Publishers Weekly for Mirror Empire, and he's like, well, I don't know why we had to make all those 63 pages of changes before the arc. It was just fine the way that it was. Can we get a starred review in Publishers Weekly? I'm like, it needed to be perfect. You needed to have all those little details. And that's where the magic happens. I think a lot of folks think, oh, the magic of world building happens before you start writing, and for me it doesn't. I actually get through the book and I find out and reveal things to myself about the world that I didn't know before through the act of writing the book. And then I go back. I'm a big rewriter. No one reads my first drafts. My spouse does not read my first drafts. My agent does not read my first drafts. No one reads them because they're horrible. They are like, how is this person literate? They should not be picking up a typewriter, let alone a computer. So I am a massive reviser, and I revise right up until the very end. And that's what you're seeing is actually a series of revision after revision after revision.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, I just did a series of posts about world building for my blog tour for the release of my book. And it's like when I was writing this, was like, oh my God, did I really do all that? And yeah, believe it or not, I did. But yeah, I agree that it kind of comes. So as I'm writing, it almost feels like I'm looking at the point, and then when I focus my eyes, I see more and more details. So when I need those details, they just come. And yeah, I do have to create them into coherent word. So one thing I did before I started writing was draw a map of my world. I did do that. And put all the geographical names so people could refer to them when they're talking. Which kind of helped also I always need a sense of like where everything is when I'm writing. But apart from that, yeah, a lot of it comes with writing. But yeah, it's kind of, to me, it was this integrated process. And certainly, yeah, it feels like a lot in retrospect, even though it didn't feel like work when I did it. So, yeah.
I had a project where I got to the point of detailing trade deficits and import-exports between different
worlds. Here's how the economy works. Yeah.
Yeah, and at that point, I was like, okay, I sorted that. I was like, I'd probably find to start drafting now.
I have reached. That is the line. I have reached it. Yeah.
It's the trade deficit line. It's going to go in my book on writing.
Yeah.
This is when you know you're done, world builders.
Cool. So that's
Yeah.
that one. And now I've got a multi-step question from a list.
Boy.
From a list I'm going to try and do in order. Alyssa is a dear friend of mine and a anthropologist, PhD, ABD.
Oh,
so
okay.
She
It's just serious. Okay.
she knows her things. Related to that previous questions, in building a secondary world, do you have any rubric for deciding what world details to create versus what world details to borrow from our world? For example, lots of secondary world fantasy has. We'll switch to the second one. Try to get all of this lined up here. Potatoes and ponies, ignoring that potatoes and ponies are geographically and environmentally specific because they're normative and uncoded in a way that, say, camels would not be. When do you include potatoes or camels? And when do you decide to make up your own?
Yeah, I think that there is a certain level of foreign detail which kind of complements a story, and when it goes over that level, the readers actually start getting lost in it. And it's a tough balance. So in my first draft of this book, I had a lot of foreign names, concepts, animals, everything. And then when I was reading that, I was thinking, oh my God, it's like, is anybody going to understand what I wrote except me? So I think it's kind of, so my rule is probably right now to introduce as little of these foreign concepts as I need to keep the plot going. So if I feel like this is really important for me to have, like I have some mounts in my book which are not horses and are a lot faster. And so these mounts were kind of important, and then they don't exist in our world. But anywhere else I could get away with like real animals. I don't have potatoes and ponies, by the way. And I don't have camels, but I might have camels, even though I'm not sure yet. So a camel to me would relay the whole setting of like kind of maybe a Middle Eastern style world. So I could use it as a tool like this. But yeah, I kind of feel like if it's not obtrusive and it works, using these foreign details is good. But once it kind of starts being noticeable by itself, it's not a good thing. It shouldn't detract from the story. So I don't know, Kameron, what do you think?
Well, I actually learned this from Taric Harper, and I don't know if she must have some stuff now, but she wrote this Wolf Walkers. There's a bunch of books, Storm Runner, actually to look her up, Greyheart. And what she did, they're actually a little bit, they almost feel science fiction once you actually get into it. They seem like they're fantasy, and then you kind of realize, oh, this might be, again, like a Pern thing going on. Now, what she did is she said, we're riding a horse. And so you're like, okay, we're riding a horse. And she's like, and then the 6 legs of the horse. And you're like, whoa, this is not a horse.
Yeah, I've seen
But
that.
the trick is giving us a familiar term, and I did that in Mirror Empire, like, it's a bear. And you're like, oh, it's a bear. And it has these massive yellow fangs and this forked tongue and these cloven, these bifurcated paws. And it's not a bear at all, and it eats primarily plants that are poisonous. Anyway, and they act as mounts. But you say it's a bear because that way we're not constantly throwing. I'm already constantly throwing at you a lot of things that you need to understand. Is it really a bladderwort, trap? No, it's really not. Like this flesh-eating plants. They're really not those things. They are their own separate things. That are a little bit different, and I try to at least tease out a few details that give you a hint that, oh yeah, it's a 6-legged horse, so it's not really a horse. But I did that to take pity on my poor readers because I do love them, and I want them to come along for the ride, and I know it's very difficult. For me, I think a lot of it was when I get bored, this is about me as a writer. When I find myself, and it was actually, I think it was my second book, Infidel, I had my characters go into someone's kitchen, and I realized I'd never been in a kitchen before in this world. And I was like, well, what is the kitchen like? Is it just a kitchen like anything else? And if that's so, then that's really boring to me. So I kind of looked at what a kitchen would look like in this particular world. So a lot of it for me is very selfishly based on like when I'm bored, and I go, okay, this is kind of boring. Or when honestly, when it doesn't make sense, when I realize, this was something. It was actually Jeff Ryman was one of my Clarion instructors in 2000. I went to Clarion West, and he said about one of my stories. He said, I think this suffers from a failure of the imagination. And like the worst thing you could ever tell a science fiction and fantasy writer, and that it was like it's his voice now, right? Like every time they walk into the kitchen, I'm like suffering from a failure of imagination, Cameron. So I really actually interrogate things. I do interrogate them, and I sit down and I go, okay, does it really need what really needs to be here? Does it really look like this? And that really, I do that at every level. Again, not first draft, but certainly in subsequent drafts, I sit down, is this really, this thing, or am I just being lazy? Am I falling back on old tropes? Am I just not thinking this through well enough? So I'm pretty thorough when I go through and clean that stuff up.
But yeah, I think it's true that we ultimately were right for our own enjoyment. We just
Sure, exactly, yeah.
So, yeah.
Solipsism plus arrogance.
Yes.
So I've got a couple more questions that I think we can probably get to.
Yeah.
Just this can be kind of scale-wise, and I think perhaps the two of you have different kind of different ways of doing this, so that's great. Riley James Keith asks, how much research goes into the world building process?
Mm.
And that's game for either of you to jump on.
Well, I started last time. You want to start?
Sure, yeah, I'll start. It really depends on the series. I started God's War, the first draft, in 2004. It was ultimately published in 2011, and I researched it basically the whole time. And while I was writing Infidel, I researched it. So I would say there was about 8 years of research that went into writing God's War and Infidel. Now that was particularly arduous because I knew I was screwing with a lot of things that could be mapped onto things that were existing today, and so I need to be very careful. I need to know my shit, right? To be blunt. I knew I needed to know what I was talking about, so I knew I needed to put in the time and effort into that. With Mirror Empire, it was, I still have been writing many versions of that book since forever, but I would say I probably put in, once I realized that there was going to be satellite magic, we were going to be dealing with flesh-eating plants, things were a lot easier and I could be very targeted, and I wanted to write a draft very quickly. I basically burned down the entire draft that I presented to my agent initially and rewrote the book from scratch. So, as far as like the new world building process, I'd say that was probably only about 6 or 8 months of, okay, let's go through different types of flesh-eating plants, different things people have done with like organic technology, and lots of things. I was building. There's like this universe sandbox. You can actually build like these fake universes and like these satellites that go around planets, and they all bump into each other and explode, and it's amazing. I played with that too much, but it was research. Listen, it was totally research, and that was probably about 6 or 8 months of that. So that was a much less rigorous process. But again, it's one of those things that it's going to be evolving over time, and it's something I continually do as I write the other books.
Mm-hmm.
Cameron, can you send me that world building app when we're done,
yes,
so I can put it in the wrap-up?
Yes, I can.
And then I will pretend that it doesn't exist so that I don't get distracted.
Yes, it's really fun. I think my husband found that one for me. He was like, oh, you've done a bad thing. Yeah, so you can get it on Steam. It's great. Yeah, I'll send it
I want to see it too. Yeah, for me, I guess world building, it takes as long as you write. So my novel, I started in 2001. So yeah, that's kind of what, like by now, 12 years of research, 13.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so some of this research is just reading history books, but yeah, there's all kinds of. So I actually researched role-playing games because I wanted to know how to handle multiple characters. So I read all these manuals, and then I played some online games, which wasn't like very hard. I mean, it was I couldn't call it like hard work exactly, but it was a lot of research. Yeah, another thing I had to research a lot was martial arts techniques, and that was kind of down to getting the weapons that are described in my book. So my book features some of the warriors, which so each of them is kind of the top in their skill, and each of them has a unique weapon crafted for this particular person. So coming up with unique weapons was a lot of fun, but then I had to make sure these weapons actually work. And it's not like I had to kill somebody to make it work, but I did have to like figure out how to draw a sword from the back, like how to draw two swords from the same sheath, things like this, how to wield the weapon, which is actually just a long chain with a ball at the end. So all these things, yeah, that it's not like I became anywhere nearly as good as my warriors are, but it did take a lot of this kinds of research. And in addition to this, of course, there was also history and geography and languages. So I actually created a language for one of the cultures, which never is even shown in the book, because then I kind of so these characters used to put in words from their language, and then everybody was telling me this is very distracting, all this foreign language, so I had to actually pluck all these words out of the book, but they're all there, and I know what everything means in their language, and I'm hoping that some of it will find its way into later books, but yeah, it's kind of, it never ends, basically, when you're working on a book, yeah. Research just goes on as long as you're writing, I think, if it's a secondary world fantasy.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point too. Is that research never stops. You know, your entire life is research, right? Everything that you experience, all of the conversations that you have are all research. You know, sitting in the coffee shop listening to people's conversations is research.
Yeah.
So it never stops. And you draw on things I think that you never thought that you'd draw on. I took some mixed martial arts and boxing classes when I lived in Chicago back when I first started God's War. And it's great because, to this day I'll still see reviews. Oh, is Kameron Hurley a professional boxer? You should read some of these scenes. I'm like, yes. That's what you want, right? You want people to think, you're faking it the whole time. And you want people to think you did more than, did a couple years of, I showed up at mixed martial arts class a couple times a week. So that's very satisfying also when you can fake it that well.
Yeah.
So we've got one more question from Twitter, and then I think we'll maybe perhaps have a final question after that. This is from Dave Robison at the Roundtable Podcast. What are the warning signs that the scope of your story has gotten out of control? And bonus points for world building and or scope out of control stories.
When you whiteboard your characters and find 12 point of view characters, that's horrible. You're doing it wrong. You're a failure.
Don't say that, Kameron. It's bad marketing.
You're really brilliant in disguise.
No, actually, for me, I have to keep the entire story in my head all the time. I have to keep track of everything and everyone. So when I lose track, I know that I've gone out of my scope. So.
And when I lose track, I'm just like, I gotta whiteboard this crap. I gotta whiteboard it right now.
No, when I lose track, first I get more coffee. But if that doesn't help, then I have to do something to my story.
Coffee has saved more writers. Yeah.
No, it has saved worlds.
Yes. No, I think it's a good question, and again, it's how much is too much. And I think Anna has a very good point, which is I know I have nailed a narrative, or that I understand a story and I can get to the end when the entire book and its entire it's all in my head where I can see it. I sit and I go, we go here and here and here and here and here, and if I cannot visualize or contain that entire story and map it in my head, I know that I'm not in a great place. And so either that means, again, which is why I whiteboarded in this particular case for book 2, and I said, okay, I need to be able to visualize this and see this, because until I can understand it in my head and get a good handle on it, I'm out of control, and we're not going to be able to get to where we need to go. So really, to me, if you feel that your brain can no longer process the story and contain it, that's the point at which you go to the whiteboards. And if you still can't do it, you got to start killing characters, or just cutting point of views, right? Or scope, or saying, hey, this entire secondary thing I was going to do is not going to fit in 3 books. That was the 15-book thing. We're not going to do that anymore. You have to be very realistic, and I think that's really hard too. As somebody coming at this where I went, oh, I have this amazing story and it's 15 books, and having the market say that's not going to happen, do you still want to tell this story? And me being like, yes, I do. Then you need to make some hard choices, and that takes a whiteboard and really being very honest with yourself and cutting things down to the absolute core of the story that you really, really want to tell.
Yeah. So it's all about the brain of the writer, I guess that's the
Yeah, is that right? Yeah, it's very personal. It's about your brain. It's about, well, what does your brain say? This is enough. More than 3 characters is too much for me. Right. So
Yeah.
it's different for everyone.
Right.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a great panel, and I wanted to thank you both so much for your great thoughts on fantasy and scope and scale. It's something I think about a lot for myself. So this entire panel series is really just a good way for me to pick the brains.
You're doing research, yeah.
Of our brilliant authors. So I please my robot overlords, and I pursue my own agenda. So that works out really well.
As it should be.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Anna Kashina and Kameron Hurley, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks, Mike, and
Thank
thanks
you.
everyone who listened.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for watching. Stay tuned for next time, and until then, stay angry.